We have made it to Friday, August 6th, day 6 of RPG A Day 2021. And the prompt today, well, it's been randomly determined by the drop of a D8 that we are going to look at the first of the alternate posts today. The prime post for today is Flavor, F for Friday. But our alternates were Chase, Explore, and Path. And so, because of the 3 rolled by my D8, as Friday brings us within range of the weekend and all that entails, this return to the random influence of my red crystal D8 has delivered the word that I wanted in my heart of hearts. Maybe our desires can influence outcomes, who can say? But regardless, for day 5 of RPG A Day 2021, the prompt we will pursue post-haste is Chase. If in your listening to this podcast you get interrupted and you'd like access to a written record, well, a version of this response can be found on the Casting Shadows blog, which is easy to find at castingshadowsblog.com. But if you'd like to continue listening, well, please stick with me now as we talk about Chase. The first time I remember it making a lasting impact on me. The first time that rules for vehicular chases made me sit up and take notice was when I read Call of Cthulhu for the first time in 1989. The game's 4th edition was my first edition of Call of Cthulhu, and from the perspective of one-stop shopping that I adhered to very grimly by necessity at that time due to lack of funds, lack of access to gaming stores, and an actual personal gaming philosophy that all you needed was the core rules. That edition, that 4th edition of Call of Cthulhu, was a gold mine. It had everything you needed. Like the hardcover 3rd edition released by Games Workshop, the rules booklets from the box sets and certain key supplements were all bundled together with few or really no changes and few, if any, additions, all under one set of covers. It wasn't the easiest to find things in, but it was a heady brew for which I was very, very ready. I was in university, I was already aware of Lovecraft, and I had spent a fun summer when I was 9 or 10, I can't remember now, pressing the librarian who was on bookmobile duty in the small village of like 600 people on the Atlantic coast in which I lived at the time. I pressed her for all of his stories that she could find. The bookmobile, for those who are unfamiliar, was a converted school bus, and it served similar communities like the one I lived in all along Nova Scotia's South Shore that were too small to have their own libraries. So being a voracious reader, a child of voracious readers as well, I would wait for the bookmobile on the edge of town on my bicycle whenever it was due, and I would chase it all the way to its parking spot near the center of town, not far from the Centennial. This was not very efficient practice. I could have just waited by the Centennial, but it was fun. On the bottom shelf of the bookmobile, all the way in the rear left corner of the bus, there was a small selection of horror and mystery books and periodicals. And among these books, I found anthologies of unsavory ends and cosmic malevolence, and I found the writings of the very disturbed individual whose personal fears, foibles, and untenable behaviors helped open the way for cosmic horror to reach a wider audience. Although now as an adult I find it sad that despite Lovecraft's own growth as a person, able to see through the lies of his overt and explicit racism. He seems to be considered unforgivable, as if others can repent, but not him. At age 9, all I knew about him was his name, and the only message I was able to get from his writings was that we as a species were equal in our insignificance. Mostly, I liked the fact that the protagonist was so often doomed from the start. It was refreshing. Failure was the story. Fast forwarding 10 years, I had a lucky confluence of being in a game store with money and finding Call of Cthulhu. In it, and this is really odd to think about now, what grabbed my attention and held it right off the bat were these simple guidelines for a 2-vehicle chase. And I can still remember the page. It's 164 and 165. Even the self-deprecating tone of how those particular rules were introduced didn't dissuade me from loving them and loving them instantly. There were going to be chases. Cultists would chase investigators. Investigators would chase cultists. Crazy investigators would chase sane investigators. Sane investigators would chase crazed investigators. Maybe even there'd be a monster, if I felt the desire to use them. There would be chases of someone or something chasing someone else or something else somewhere else. Now, there have been times when a part of a game that really grabs me has not been the part of the game that grabs the group as a whole. And often this is something like space combat or playing spies instead of, more frontline characters. But this was not one of those times. We had chases, and despite whatever shortcomings the writer perceived in those rules at the time that they were created, they gave us great fun. We had a blast, especially when trees were involved somewhat explosively at the end of chases. Anyway, chases, a really fun and exciting part of the memories I have of gaming. Incidentally, it strikes me now that my lengthy period in pursuit of complete game lines begins with Call of Cthulhu. The blame can be laid there, and on me, of course. That 4th edition, which is still my favorite, led me to buy, for no good reason at all, considering that the content was virtually the same. It led me to buy the 3rd edition when I found it in nearly mint condition in a used section of the same game store in which I bought the 4th edition. That led me to start buying every supplement for Call of Cthulhu that Chaosium ever produced for 4th edition, 3rd edition, 5th, or any previous edition. That led me to doing the same thing for the World of Darkness, and that led me to doing the same thing for Shadowrun, and, well, I don't want to continue, but you get the idea. It sparked an urge to chase down new games and each aspect of them in utter defiance of how I started in the hobby. I started with a hand-me-down copy of Moldvay Basic, and the people that I played with, some of them had Holmes, and some of them had Moldvay, and some of them had gotten the new, it was new at that time, Menser set, and some people even had AD&D, but I had Moldvay, and I had Basic only, and that's all I had, and all I would have for years, and it's all I needed, and I never felt the lack. Eventually, around 86, I got used copies of the rules for AD&D, and that's all I needed for years. But 4th edition of Call of Cthulhu changed all of that. Now, decades later, that chase is, in most respects, over. Like in that masterpiece of cinema, War Games, I learned to win by choosing not to play. I left the race. Now I just chase, and at a dignified pace. I only pursue core books, but I do it for each edition of the games that interest me. It's inconvenient for shelving to try and find space for the first edition, second edition, third edition, fourth edition of whatever game I'm interested in. But it is better for my health. It's better for my happiness as a gamer. And it's, of course, better for not having all of that mass cause the house to shrink down into a black hole and consume us all. Anyway, I still feel the thrill of that chase every now and then. It's how I know I'm still alive. If you're curious about that fourth edition, if you'd like to see it in a video and see a light comparison to some other editions of Call of Cthulhu, there is a link in the show notes, and there's a video embedded in the text at castingshadowsblog.com. It's called Mystique of Call of Cthulhu 4th edition. It's simply nostalgia with a little bit of logic thrown in. Tomorrow we finish our first week of RPG a Day for 2021. Tomorrow is the 7th. It's Saturday. And we have 4 prompts. The primary prompt, going with S for Saturday, is small. The other 3 are inspiration, better, and engage. Can you believe it? We're just a day away from our first full week of the 8th RPG a Day. I hope you're enjoying it. I am. You have been listening to another day's installment from RPG a Day 2021 from the Casting Shadows podcast. This podcast is an extension of the Casting Shadows blog, now sailing into its 11th year, and also an extension of our channel on YouTube, which lives under the name of Runeslinger.